Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. We're pleased to have back Senior Fellow in Healthcare Studies, Dr. Henry Miller. COVID-19 cases have been reaching record levels, even as we are closer to a vaccine. Tim and I, PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I chat with Dr. Miller about the second wave of the pandemic, how will the new administration deal with the coronavirus, and the steps we can take to protect ourselves. Thanks for joining us. So as a former founding director of the FDA's Office of Biotechnology, I know you follow vaccine and drug development closely. Pfizer recently announced that they are close to a vaccine. Please update us on the progress to find a vaccine. Where are we on testing and approvals, and what are some of the obstacles going forward?
Sure. Well, there's tremendous activity in vaccine R&D for COVID-19. Currently, there are 66 discrete vaccines in clinical trials and a dozen in phase 3, which are the large-scale clinical trials that a manufacturer undertakes before seeking approval. So there's a lot in the pipeline. The Pfizer vaccine appears to be the most advanced. They announced just a few days ago that in a what we call an advanced peek at the data, that is, there's a data safety monitoring committee, so-called, that gets to look at the unblinded data while the trial is underway to see whether, on the one hand, there's significant efficacy, or on the other hand, there are significant problems that could cause the trial to be stopped. And Pfizer reported, at least in press releases, that their vaccine appears to be more than 90% effective in this advanced peek at the data. So that's a very good sign. The way that I would characterize it, though, is that using a football analogy, since it's football season, it's sort of like second down and goal to go from the 8-yard line. It's pretty high probability that we'll get over the goal line, but it's not an absolutely sure thing, because what we don't know from the press releases is whether FDA has evaluated, inspected the manufacturing site or sites, and whether there are any problems there, and how well the data are being collated, crunched by the manufacturer, and submitted to FDA. Once it's at FDA, it needs to go to the FDA Vaccines Advisory Committee, as well as being evaluated by the FDA scientists themselves. So we're getting close on that one. There are a few others that are close behind, and a whole lot that are much farther behind. But we seem to be making real progress, and that's a cause for optimism.
Henry, once we do get the vaccines, how effective are they likely to be? And what are some of the risks? Is this really the silver bullet that everyone is waiting for?
Well, the reason that we do very large clinical trials in subject where the product is going to be administered to healthy patients is to get answers to those kinds of questions. So the Pfizer study, the Pfizer phase 3 study, involved some 44,000 subjects. And one of FDA's requirements for COVID-19 vaccines is that the safety data must include an evaluation of at least half of the subjects who have received their final dose. The Pfizer vaccine is a 2-dose regimen, so we will have significant safety data before the company can submit an application for approval to FDA. There's another more nuanced obstacle with this vaccine, and that has to do with distribution and storage. Unusually, this vaccine has to be maintained frozen at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's extremely unusual and difficult for the usual kinds of shipping services like FedEx or UPS. And so Pfizer has designed special dry ice boxes that in which they'll ship it and keep it. The other thing is that once it's thawed at the site of actual use, it only lasts for 2 days at refrigerator temperatures. So this needs to be coordinated, choreographed very carefully in order that we take advantage of all the vaccine, because it'll be in limited supply at first, and not lose any to deterioration. So it's a very complex process in so many ways. But, thus far, it's been very promising.
Hey, Henry, I have a follow-up on that. So, we've got this Pfizer vaccine that looks promising and, but there are other, and lots of other companies producing vaccines. Like, how do you know which one is right for you? I mean, is one going to be better for, a person with this issue or that issue, or someone younger versus someone older? Or how do we know with all of this menu of vaccines that will be coming up, which one to pick?
Well, the short answer is that until we see all the data, we don't know. So we don't know, again, from the Pfizer press release data, which is minimal, whether it's been effective in the elderly, whether it's been effective in kids, how many of those groups and also different ethnic groups it's been tested. We don't know that until we see the actual data. So and also there may be differences in side effects. There's a little information dribbling out about the side effects of the Pfizer vaccine, which include pain at the injection site, chills, and fever, but not terribly severe in severity. So it seems to be a little bit more prone to side effects than, say, the common flu vaccines, but not as bad as, say, the current generation shingles vaccine, which has pretty potent side effects in about 15% of people who get it.
So turning to therapeutics, where are we there for COVID-19?
Well, there are lots and lots of therapeutics in clinical trials, hundreds, in fact, that anyone interested can find on clinicaltrials.gov, the government website that compiles clinical trials. And the good news is that the various drugs are attacking the virus and the illness that it causes in a number of different ways. So we have antiviral drugs like remdesivir, which recently gained full approval from the FDA, and which has been shown to shorten hospital stays for people who need to be hospitalized. So that's used in patients who have significant severe illness. Then there are drugs that are sort of a blunt instrument approach, like dexamethasone, which is a potent steroid similar to prednisone but more potent, which is used to dampen the immune response in patients who are very ill with COVID-19 and have an exaggerated immune response that itself can be life-threatening. Then there are the monoclonal antibodies, which also have the effect of an antiviral effect. They compete for the receptor that enables on which the virus attaches to cells, and so blunt the effect of the virus that way. And there are lots more to come using a whole lot of very different approaches. I just saw today a paper on that used a common antidepressant drug, and there was some promising data on its ability to prevent deterioration once a person is infected with the coronavirus. So there are all sorts of things underway. We hope for a magic bullet. We're more likely just to get even more and more pretty good ways to manage the disease.
So, Henry, we have a transition between the Trump and Biden administrations coming up in about 8 weeks. So how do you see a transition between two presidential administrations affecting the work of the FDA and all federal government agencies in fighting COVID-19? Do you see immediate policy shifts starting on January 20th?
Well, that's a very good question, Tim. And as you know, there's been a great deal of turmoil about the transition, about the government agencies and government officials in the Trump administration cooperating, or as it happens, largely not cooperating with the Biden transition people. President-elect Biden has selected a coronavirus task force of some 13 people and put out a plan to manage the pandemic, which really struck me and many of my colleagues as more of a campaign document than a real blueprint for management. But we'll see. The hope, of course, is that there will be good cooperation between the public health officials in the Trump administration. So we'll see if that happens.
Now, you've written about some of the long-term effects of getting COVID-19. Can you share some of those findings?
Yeah, that's the long-term effect or persistent symptoms would be another way to put it, is really quite vexing. There was an Italian study and another one that found that more than 80% of hospitalized patients who have been severely ill and hospitalized with COVID-19, have at least one persisting symptom 2 months after their discharge from the hospital. And that's unusual for common respiratory viruses, such as flu or respiratory syncytial virus or the kinds of coronaviruses that cause the common cold, of which there are 4. Also, there are a significant number of patients with only mild symptoms who have persisting symptoms, and they can range from shortness of breath to cough to recurrent fevers and so on. And Tony Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, estimate that the frequency in patients who have had mildly symptomatic COVID-19 at 25 to 35% having some persistent symptoms. Now, that's a number that seems high to me. He follows this more closely with greater proximity to the data than I do, but it gives you an idea for how frequent that can be. The greater worry is that there's a population who have had mild illnesses but go on to become what are variously called long-termers or long haulers who experience many really debilitating symptoms: fatigue, weakness, fevers, muscle aches, cognitive distortion or brain fog for months after their nominal recovery. And we don't have good numbers on such people, but I can tell you that there are thousands of them on internet support groups. So this is really worrisome. And this is one reason that we can't underestimate the importance of this illness, and why allowing it to run rampant through the community in an attempt to get herd immunity is really a terrible and irresponsible idea.
So, Henry, here's something that I've been wondering about. Will the pandemic just go away? For example, when we reach so-called herd immunity?
Well, that's a very frequent question, of course. The answer depends, Tim, on several things. One is the durability of immunity from both natural infections and vaccines. That is, once you've been infected in the community or you get the vaccine, how long will immunity last? And we don't know that yet because the situation is all so relatively new, particularly with respect to vaccines. The second factor is how absolute immunity is. What kind of immunity is conferred by natural infection or vaccines? And by that I mean the possibilities are what we call sterile immunity, which means that the vaccine or natural infection totally prevents any subsequent infection. So there may be exposure to virus, but it doesn't take hold at all because the immune system rejects it. Another kind of immunity, it would be that the immune system merely prevents the occurrence of symptoms, so you can become infected and even shed virus and potentially transmit it, but you yourself have a kind of immunity that prevents the development of symptoms. And then a third level would be prevention of severe disease. And this is sort of like what happens with many people who get flu vaccine. They do become infected, but they don't go on to have really severe disease and need to be hospitalized. So that's the second factor. Third factor, of course, is people's willingness to continue to observe safe practices even after we are near or at herd immunity, because herd immunity simply means that so many people in the population are immune in one way or another to the virus that it has difficulty finding new targets, new susceptible people, and we'll need to do those basic preventative measures in order to really to keep the levels near zero.
So the U.S. is in the top 10 in deaths per million population among all countries in the world. Among major industrialized countries, only Spain and Belgium have worse numbers. The administration's handling of the pandemic has been widely criticized by the scientific and medical communities, even by U.S. government scientists. What do you think?
Well, I think the Trump administration began in the spring fairly auspiciously with its post-lockdown plan to reopen the economy in a phased way. So there were certain criteria that would need to be met: decreasing curves of cases, contact tracing, robust testing, and so on. But then the administration seemed to lose its focus and promoted premature lifting of restrictions, encouraged, there were slogans like freedom now and open up and so on. That lost the momentum that we needed. Part of that is that there's been a lot of happy talk and poor role modeling from federal officials. So the president and his minions repeatedly held what were sure to be super spreader events. Hence, you're familiar with the large number of COVID infections in White House staff. And over the past month, they've even advocated letting the virus proliferate, as I mentioned, in order to get to natural herd immunity, which is just a myth. By contrast, there are successful national models elsewhere, countries like Japan, Iceland, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and they've used different approaches, but all depended on first suppressing cases and then doing aggressive contact tracing, isolation, and quarantine, sometimes with new technology like programs on cell phones or Apple Watches that record contacts that infected people may have had in the recent past.
Henry, what steps can we as citizens take to respond to these surges?
Well, for the time being, and this will sound like the same broken record you hear from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx on cable networks, we need to observe the basic pillars of protection: wearing masks, physical distancing, frequent hand washing, and avoiding crowds, especially indoors. And unfortunately, that also includes large family gatherings or gatherings of friends, which is particularly difficult at this time of year with Thanksgiving and the Christmas holidays approaching. But the data are very clear that it's these casual social gatherings that are often transmission events, and we just need to be conscientious about that for our own sake and for the community at large. The other thing is that it behooves all of us to squelch anti-vaccine propaganda and the claims of the anti-vax people that the pandemic's dangers are exaggerated, that masks don't work, vaccines are dangerous, that they're part of some sort of sinister conspiracy, and so on. That's very important.
Dr. Miller, Joe Biden has indicated that he will work with governors and, if necessary, mayors and county governments to implement a national mask mandate. Is this a good idea? And what's the best type of mask to wear?
Well, we, in general terms, we need to wear more masks and more of the time. But like other government policies, mandates should be sensible. So, for example, a masking requirement should be stricter for public transport and indoors in places like schools and high-risk businesses and factories, but less so for outdoor activities, with the exception of rallies and perhaps being a spectator at an athletic event. Preventing contracting COVID-19 in yourself and spreading it in the community is all about probabilities. So there are carry different risks, different activities that carry different risks, and different things that you can do to prevent infection and transmission. So it's going to be difficult, as I said, at this time of year with cold weather and holidays, but we just have to bite the bullet and do it.
Henry, how are the public disposed toward vaccines? And what can we do to raise the percentage of the population that opts to take them once they're approved?
Well, there are some opposing forces that are affecting people's perception. The federal government created a very aggressive and extremely innovative and worthwhile program called Operation Warp Speed to speed the development of vaccines. The government put money up front into assuring that there would be manufacturing facilities available even before the clinical trials were completed. But the choice of the term warp speed implied to some people that there was a rush going on, too much of a rush, perhaps, by the government to get these products out. And so some people have reacted by being reluctant to get the vaccine. So various recent polls have shown that perhaps as many as 30 to 50% of the public are reluctant to take the first COVID vaccine. And that reluctance has also been encouraged by the anti-vaccine lobby. I sometimes refer to it as the anti-vaccine crazies, who have come up with all sorts of bizarre claims about the hazards of vaccines in general and the COVID vaccines in particular. So if those numbers, poll numbers hold, we will never get to herd immunity because it's been calculated that we would need immunity in about 70% of the population in order to have something approaching herd immunity. So if you have a 90% effective vaccine like Pfizer's, you'd have to inoculate about 70%, 75% at least, 75 to 80% actually, of the population in order to get immunity in 70% of the public. So that's sort of where we are. A PR campaign, an aggressive campaign to educate the public is absolutely essential to getting widespread immunity.
Andrew Cuomo, Gavin Newsom, and others have said that they will have state-level task forces to review any approved COVID-19 vaccines before allowing them to be administered in their states. Is this a good idea or a bad idea? And what power do states have to block vaccines if they so choose?
Well, I think the short answer is I think it's a terrible idea. I think the governors are attempting to reassure their populations that these products will have been extensively, carefully vetted. But in doing so, they imply that FDA is unwilling or incapable of doing that sort of review, although it's what FDA scientists and physicians do all day, every day. The other thing is that, I speak as someone who spent 15 years at the FDA, partly reviewing products as a medical reviewer and partly doing policy work. And it's extremely complicated to review these applications. For one thing, they run hundreds of thousands of pages in volume. For another, the statistics are difficult and arcane, and the manufacturing aspects of it are also very difficult to evaluate. So the facilities need to be inspected. The inspectors need to be sure there are standard operating procedures that are being adhered to. They check whether the manufacturer can produce batch after batch after batch that meet the appropriate standards of purity, potency, and potency and safety. And even scientists at universities, such as UCSF and Berkeley and so on, are not familiar with the nuances of bad idea, and I think it's unnecessary. You also asked about about the power that states have to block vaccines. I'm only a humble physician and molecular biologist, and that's really a question for legal scholars. But I can tell you that there are two kind of opposing factors that determine that question. So there's the Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution, which attempts to make the marketing of product consistent and homogeneous throughout the country, which would imply that once the federal standard is met, the vaccines should be marketable in California and New York as well as elsewhere. But there's also states' rights to impose additional regulatory strictures. And so in California, as you know, we've seen that with Proposition 65, which goes to special labeling of certain products and activities, and also the strictures that California puts on different blends of gasoline depending on times of the year. So there's a tension between those two things. But as I say, that's an issue for legal scholars.
Finally, looking forward to 2021, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the course of the pandemic?
I'm afraid, Tim, I'm pessimistic. On November 11th, the number of new daily infections topped 140,000. Average daily deaths shot past 1,000 mark, and COVID-19 hospitalizations hit a record high of more than 65,000. And the curves are all going in the wrong direction. Hospitals, and particularly ICUs, are overwhelmed in much of the country. And with the cold weather and the holidays approaching, I think the situation is going to become even worse.
On that note, it's always so great to get your opinion, Dr. Miller, and we'll definitely have you back to give us an update on any new developments with COVID-19. Thanks so much.
Thank you both. It's a pleasure, as always.
Thanks to our guest, Dr. Henry Miller. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and now iHeartRadio and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.